Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 11 of the Superman on Film podcast. It's funny, next week I will finally be able to say coming to you live from the Garage of Solitude, because Monday night marks the first episode of the final season of Superman and Lois, and I'm planning to do a post-show live reaction after every episode here on the Superman on Film YouTube channel. So please subscribe and be sure to check this space 15 minutes after any conclusion of a Superman and Lois episode this final season, and you'll see me go live, and sometimes I'll have a special super friend on with me and sometimes I won't, and together or solo I will be analyzing and breaking down what we just saw in what is sure to be a very hard-hitting, very intense final season of Superman and Lois, if these trailers we've been seeing are any indication. I cannot wait. And this Monday, October 9th, we'll have the 2-hour season starter. All right. We're going to kick things off with a 2-hour episode. So I'm sure there's going to be plenty to say, as it is essentially going to be like receiving a Superman movie next Monday. So be sure to tune in October 9th, 15 minutes after the episode ends, here on the Superman on Film YouTube channel. But let's go ahead and get into this week's Superman on Film update, because currently we are 41 weeks away from the arrival of James Gunn's Superman, and this week's Superman on Film update is actually a bit of a fun one. There is actual, legitimate, new information about this James Gunn Superman movie that's coming out. It's been a little bit since we've had real news and not just sort of rumors to try to parse through and analyze. So the big news this week is that DC veteran Alan Tudyk has officially joined the cast of James Gunn's Superman. And this is interesting because he's already part of the DCU. You see, Alan Tudyk is already the voice of Dr. Phosphorus on the upcoming Creature Commandos animated series coming from James Gunn. So you hear Alan Tudyk is joining the cast of Superman, and it's a kind of perplexing bit of news if you ask me, because he's already playing Dr. Phosphorus. We've already established that actors will be playing their same characters across all the different action media. So in other words, if you get cast to be in a DCU movie and your character ends up on a DCU TV series, you will play them there. And if your character ends up in a DCU animated series or a video game, you will voice them there, and the character will be modeled after your likeness. So we've already sort of established that this is how James Gunn and Peter Safran are going to be handling the DCU and their projects coming out of DC Studios. And yet here we have Alan Tudyk seemingly already playing another character within it, where we're going to have heard his voice as Dr. Phosphorus in Creature Commandos, but we are potentially meeting him and seeing him as an entirely different character in James Gunn's Superman. Now, of course, there's all kinds of rumors as to what this can be. Alan Tudyk is someone who has shown a great ability and propensity to do some of the more sci-fi heavy characters out there. He was in I, Robot. He's been in lots of things where he's had to appear as some sort of motion capture, or he's had to provide some sort of unique, distinct voice. You know, he's a very good moldable character actor who's very comfortable with the technical aspect of things. In a lot of ways, he's kind of like Andy Serkis, or even almost like Doug Jones, where there are these actors who sort of specialize in interesting CG-heavy performances and who just seem to understand what goes into these big, larger-than-life, geek, fanboy-type properties. So Alan Tudyk, I mean, even before this, he's already been all over DC. He was in Doom Patrol. He's done voices for different animated DC projects. I believe he's been both Green Arrow and The Flash. So Alan Tudyk is kind of, one of these actors who, when it comes to DC, he's got quite a resume already, quite a roster of DC Comics characters that he's already played. And that's honestly why this news to me was kind of like, Like, really? You couldn't find anyone else? You mean to tell me that there's no other actor in the world who could have played whatever it is you have him doing in this Superman movie? I mean, listen, and I love Alan Tudyk. I do. You know, I loved Firefly. I thought Serenity was a great movie. I loved him in Dodgeball as the pirate. I've loved him in everything. Alan Tudyk is a wonderful, very versatile actor. My mother loves him. He's on the show. He's the star of the show Resident Alien. So, Mom, if you're watching, just so you know, that's who Alan Tudyk is. But yes, my mom, my own Ma Kent, back home in Smallville, a.k.a. the Upper West Side of Manhattan, does watch the show. So now we just clued her in. So anyway, so Alan Tudyk playing all these roles within DC already, and already having a DCU role established as Dr. Phosphorus in the Creature Commandos, that kind of, to me, it takes the fun out of this casting, because it's like, you really, like, there's so many actors in the world. Alan was the only guy you could find for this. That's why a part of me is really hoping that the casting news was just missing a bit of information. That maybe they heard he was officially on the cast list for Superman, but they didn't realize that he is already established as another character in this universe. So therefore, that's obviously who he's playing in Superman. You know, maybe the reporter didn't know this, and therefore that means that Alan Tudyk will just be playing Dr. Phosphorus again, but in live action form. Because it's already been implied, by the way, that Frank Grillo, who plays Rick Flag Sr., in the Creature Commandos, the animated project, it's already been confirmed that he, in live action mode, will be appearing in Peacemaker. And it's also been alluded to that he's going to be in Superman. So if Rick Flag is there, the rest of his Creature Commandos might be there. So therefore, this all might just be that Dr. Phosphorus and the other Creature Commandos have a quick scene in James Gunn's Superman. And that I wouldn't have a problem with. That if it's just literally an extension of the Creature Commandos, and we're going to see a really cool photorealistic live action version of the Dr. Phosphorus that we will have met several months prior in the animated series, that sounds great. But if Alan Tudyk is playing an entirely separate character, to me, it's like, come on, there's so many actors in the world. All right. Nothing against you, Alan. But the other big news, which isn't necessarily news, but the writer Ana Nogueira, who's writing Supergirl and is also working on a Teen Titans movie, was just spotlighted on Variety's new Power of New York 2024 list. And I like this because... And the main reason I want to mention it is because it's nice to see these DC projects all having this air of prestige around them, where the talent involved with them are all coming from winning projects, and they're all spoken of as in glowing ways as these are the talents to look out for in the future. And if you look at everything going on with DC Studios right now, it's all thumbs up. You know, right now, The Penguin is out there getting great ratings on HBO and great reviews for Max and everything. Like, The Penguin is an outright smash hit. Superman, which is the other big bit of news I want to offer you as a Superman on film update. Superman, the Christopher Reeve story, has just been announced as getting a wide release next month. Which that's all entirely due to the fact that the buzz around the film is so huge. It's got a 100% approval rating on Rotten Tomatoes from critics and from audiences. And it just seems to be this incredible, seminal, important documentary about one of the most important figures of the last 50 years of popular culture. And that's Christopher Reeve and his Superman. And the way he's, impacted so many lives. So now that movie is going into wide release next month. So, hey, we're going to have to see that, Ma, if you're watching this. Everything coming from DC Studios right now has an air of excitement around it. So now let's go ahead and get to this week's main topic. Since it was the final week of September, I did put up a poll and you voted. And the winner this week was The Ballad of Superman Returns. And the reason I call it a ballad is because, think about it, when you listen to an album from your favorite artist, usually there's different kinds of songs on that album, right? There'll be the song that's a little more catchy and poppy and upbeat that stays with you. Then there's the ones that are a little more amped and extra energetic that you might listen to when you want to go work out or get hyped up for something. And then there's usually a ballad or two, a slow, sentimental, nice, romantic type song that's there to just kind of, give you a chance to catch your breath and enjoy something a little gentler while it's something you might listen to at the end of a long, dreary day, just to kind of sit down and get lost in your thoughts and reflect. A ballad just tends to be the gentler, more sentimental song on the track, on the album. And when it comes to Superman Returns, a Superman film that was 19 years in the making, we ultimately got in theaters a beautiful ballad about Superman. And it's one that most people apparently didn't really want to listen to. People wanted something a little catchier, a little poppier, with a little more oomph to it. And that's why several years later, we got a hard rock song of a Superman movie called Man of Steel. But let's go ahead and dive into the history of how we arrived at this ballad. And by the way, it's a beautiful ballad. I have some wonderful things to say about the movie, and I have some honest assessments that I have to share about the movie. So it's going to be a nice little journey. Strap yourselves in tight, because this one, honestly, the history lesson here, it goes all the way back to about 1996. All right, because even though this film came out in 2006, it really began its gestation when Warner Brothers was trying to figure out, where do we go next with Superman? A Superman 5 had been talked about, but really more of a pipe dream. And once Christopher Reeve got injured the way he was, a Superman 5 film really just disappeared. And then the next thing we were talking about was Superman Reborn, which became Superman Lives. And that was announced in 96. And from 96 through 98, that was going to be the way we got back to Superman. We were going to have Tim Burton directing a film starring Nicolas Cage that was going to tell a very unique Burton-esque version of the Superman story, where he has died and he's coming back and fights a giant spider. I mean, there's going to be a whole episode on Superman Lives at one point. But that film went the way of the dodo in 1998, and all of the costs associated with it were held off until there would be a Superman movie. So in other words, whatever they spent on developing Superman Lives, that then got rolled over into whatever the eventual Superman reboot would be, because technically this is money that they had spent on Superman. And when it comes to Superman Lives, they'd already spent over $25 million on just Nicolas Cage and Tim Burton alone, because they signed what are called pay or play deals, which is, we get paid whether this movie happens or not. So right off the bat, 25 mil gets pushed on to the next Superman production, since that one didn't get picked up. And mind you, that wasn't the only cost. They also, there was R&D that went into developing the costumes. Sets had already started getting built. Like, there was a fair amount of investment put into Superman Lives. And I'm bringing this up because all of this would eventually work against Superman Returns. Okay. But after Superman Lives, a few years later, the big news was Batman versus Superman, that they were going to make a movie that was going to introduce a new Superman and a new Batman, and it was going to be directed by Wolfgang Peterson. And we were going to get that was going to be our new route back to getting Superman on the big screen. And listen, just like with the first one, the Superman Lives, I would have been there. Seeing Batman and Superman fight is not my main cup of tea, but listen, I'm not beholden to one thing. I just love Superman. So here came a second possibility to see him return, and I was ready to follow it. And from 2002 through around 2004, that was what we were kind of gearing up for. And I, as a Superman fan, that's what I was mentally preparing for, this Batman versus Superman movie. But then That one went the way of the dodo as well in 2003 throughout 2004, around then, because Warner Brothers decided instead of doing a Batman versus Superman movie, let's go ahead and just reintroduce Superman and reintroduce Batman, and then we'll decide later how we cross those two over. And from there, while Batman was taking pitches from Darren Aronofsky, and there was all interesting possibilities for how Batman might get reintroduced, Superman got like 2 or 3 different failures to launch. Okay? Because after Batman versus Superman, the next big thing was Superman Flyby, directed by Mick G and written by J.J. Abrams. And then when that fell apart because Mick G didn't want to fly to Australia because that's where Warner Brothers was going to get a nice big fat tax break to film their movie, and it was going to offset some of the cost of this new Superman movie. Mick G had a fear of flying, and he also said he just didn't feel right about filming such an important bit of American folklore in another country. So he bailed, and once he bailed, then Brett Ratner came in and the project started to morph again. And then after Brett Ratner stepped in, the next big permutation of Superman on film at last became Superman Returns. Because in June of 2004, Bryan Singer made his pitch. And this is a Bryan Singer who was coming off of a huge win. X2, X-Men United, had come out the prior year, and it was a critical smash, it was a hit with fans, and it made a boatload of money for Fox. So Bryan Singer was coming in as a made man who had made 2 successful X-Men movies, and the more recent of which had gotten even better than the first one. And in general, his filmography was very strong. You know, he had made Apt Pupil with Ian McKellen. He had made The Usual Suspects, which that was a very special movie for me. I'll never forget going to see that with a few of my bros. I think it was probably my 12th birthday when that came out. And my dad got tickets for me and 2 or 3 of my best friends to go see that on opening weekend. And Usual Suspects, I just thought was one of the greatest things. That the big twist at the end, if you haven't seen it yet, I won't spoil it for you. But in general, that movie right away put Bryan Singer on my radar as a filmmaker to look out for. And it put Kevin Spacey on my radar as an actor to pay attention to. And he won an Academy Award for The Usual Suspects. And that relationship with Bryan Singer would come in handy several years later when Superman Returns came up. But either way, Bryan Singer made his pitch and he got the job. The Brett Ratner Superman project suddenly disappeared. And instead of getting a reboot of Superman, we were now going to get basically Superman 5. We were going to get a pseudo sequel to what had come before, and I was ecstatic. Because here's the thing, I would have been there for Flyby, where Krypton is still around, and Lex Luthor is an alien, and Jimmy Olsen is played by one of the Wayans brothers. Like, listen, I was going to be there no matter what happened, no matter what version we got of a Superman reboot, I was going to be there on day one. But when they announced Bryan Singer, and they announced that rather than reboot, he's actually going to find a way to continue the Reeve legacy, and that we were likely to hear the John Williams music, and that this was essentially going to be our Superman 5. I mean, that was it was emotional for me, because Bryan Singer was already a filmmaker I believed in from X2 and from Usual Suspects. And X2, mind you, that was a movie that it hit me like a ton of bricks. And meanwhile, I didn't care about the X-Men. Like, I didn't see the first X-Men movie in theaters. I didn't bother. I saw it on VHS with my girlfriend at the time on the couch a year later. And I'd never read any of the comics, and I never watched that Fox cartoon series on the X-Men that all of my contemporaries all loved. I had no care whatsoever for the X-Men. I went to see X2 with a couple of pals who were really excited for it. And I sat in that theater riveted, on the edge of my seat with goosebumps and adrenaline. And when it was over, I was like ready to go again. And suddenly I was an X-Men fan. And I went back 2 more times. That was the first time I ever went to see a movie 3 times in theaters by myself. That's how much of an impact X2 had on me. So imagine, if you will, a year later when they say that Bryan Singer and his creative team from X2 are taking over Superman. They're bringing back the classic iteration of the character. And it's going to essentially continue that franchise. It was like, it felt like a gift. It felt like the biggest miracle, because I would have been there no matter what. I would have been there no matter which Superman you gave me. But you're giving me my Superman? You're giving me the one that I grew up on, the one that I know every musical cue for, and who I could just recite whole passages of dialogue out of their film from. You're going to give me back my Superman? It was an unbelievable feeling. And due to believing so much in Bryan Singer and his creative team, my expectations soared after that. If I was going to be there no matter what, just because I'm a Superman ride or die to the previous Superman reboot attempts, now I am the biggest cheerleader ever for this one, because now you're giving me my dude. Okay. And then as we started getting more information, we found out that it's not really Superman 5. It's actually technically Superman 3. As the film's production, got further along, we found out that essentially they were going to be ignoring Superman 3 and Superman 4 and just acting like this is the next story after Superman 2. And I found that interesting. I thought it was a fairly bold choice. And I just hoped that this wouldn't cause any confusion in the marketplace, any confusion amongst fans who were like, well, what is this? It's called Superman Returns, but what number would this be? And is this supposed to be a sequel, or is it not? I was a little worried about the fact that it's technically part 5, but we're treating it like part 3, but we're not calling it either of those things. And, I thought it would be confusing, but you know what? Any concerns I had were getting swatted down every other week, because Bryan Singer started releasing these video blogs from Australia, from the set of the film. And these video blogs gave me life. These video blogs, I had never followed a film this way before. I had already been following just based on news articles in Variety and The Hollywood Reporter and whatever information would make its way onto the early days of the internet in the early 2000s. That was my main way of trying to find out what was going on with movies. None of the films that I was following or passionate about had a director who was regularly posting videos from the set of making the dang thing. That just wasn't happening. And it was happening for Superman. So I was getting insight into how the Man of Steel was going to return to the skies. I was getting glimpses from behind the scenes, and all the different blogs would focus on different elements. There was one that was about flying. There was one about music. There was one about the general design of the character. There was, these Bryan's blogs covered such a whole gamut of what it took to make this movie. And following those blogs was just it was one of the coolest times to be alive as a Superman fan, where one of your favorite filmmakers is dropping videos from the set of your favorite superhero about how he's going to make them awesome again. It was a really magical time from 2005 through early 2006 as we were getting those Bryan's blogs leading up to the release of the movie. And then at a certain point, we finally got our first look at Brandon Routh in the suit, because, Brandon had been cast and I'd seen the pictures and I could see, okay, he's got that Superman look. I didn't think it was quite as uncanny as other people did, where a lot of people thought he looked just like Christopher Reeve. To me, he looked just like Superman. He didn't look like Christopher so much to me. But when they announced him and they showed the pictures of what he looked like then before they'd even started filming, I just remember thinking, he's got the look. And I found out that he had auditioned for Smallville and that in general, he had been kind of flirting with the possibility of being Superman for a while. And he had wanted to be Superman for a while. So I was very eager to see what this homeboy was going to look like in the suit, So finally, we got our first image of Brandon Routh in the suit. And I'll never forget where I was. I was actually in my mother's apartment. I was having a visit and I was doing my usual checkup on IGN.com for news. And all of a sudden there was the headline, first image of Brandon Routh as Superman from Superman Returns has been released. And when I looked at it, I felt a little weird. Like on the one hand, I think Brandon, and I still do, he looked the part. He had the face. He has the build. He's very, very Superman. But looking at the suit, I felt strange. To me, the S looked too small. The neckline looked very tight. The cape looked very brown, almost like a maroon color and a weird, almost shiny texture. And the boots had that same brown maroon. And they added the S to the belt, which wasn't something that the Christopher Reeve suit had. And look, one big quibble I had right out of the gate was the S was a different S than the Christopher Reeve S. It didn't have the same little tail on the top right corner. So to me, the suit was a little bit worrisome because it was like, well, we're going for a direct sequel, apparently. This is supposed to be a sequel. But the suit seems like an entirely new version of a Superman suit. It's a very different take with that belt and the smaller S and an S that isn't the same S as Christopher's S. And it just, I was excited, but I was a little bit like, that's a little worrisome. Why didn't they just do just a modern update of Christopher's exact suit, since this is supposed to be the Christopher Superman, So it was a little confusing, but still I was excited to see what would come next. And what would come next, finally, was a teaser that was released along with Batman Begins. And I'll never forget seeing that teaser for the first time. I remember I had set up a huge watch party screening for Batman Begins, because that's something I was doing a lot at that time, where I would invite 20, 25 people. And however many people there were, I would front the money, buy all the tickets, get there early, hold all the seats. And everyone would arrive and we'd watch the movie together and then go analyze it afterward. And I remember for Batman Begins, it was a huge screening. There were so many people interested in this at the time that I remember getting a newspaper and pulling out newspaper sheets to cover each of the seats I was going to need, because I was going to need essentially like a whole row to fit all my friends for Batman Begins. So I'll never forget like covering all these chairs with newspaper pages and having to tell people like, hey, this row is spoken for. Thank you. And I remember I had my buddy Joel right next to me, and he was my other big Superman nerd friend who, just like me, like we would listen to the score and be like, oh, you hear that? That's when that happened. Oh, and remember this from that. Like, he was my other big just Superman nerd who also collected shirts and also was just like, he watched these blogs with me too. And we would analyze the Bryan blogs, And I remember when that little green thing came up for, the preview, and then we go black and we start hearing the beginning of the John Williams Planet Krypton music. I freaked out. I grabbed Joel by the arm. And then when we start seeing these epic visuals, and then you hear the ba, 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 ba. And then you hear Marlon Brando's voice, and you hear the Jor-El monologue of, they can be a great people, Kal-El. they wish to be. Like the whole thing, it was, I mean, even now talking about it, I don't know if the camera can pick it up. I'm all goosebumped out right now. It was an emotional, religious experience to, after all these years, after 19 years of waiting, I was going to see Superman again on the big screen. Because I had been waiting since seeing Superman 4 in 1987. And now, after all of this, here he was in front of me. So the teaser, I thought, was magnificent. I thought it right away established what this was. And it made Superman seem larger than life and mythological just right out of the gate. And I was dying to see what a Superman movie done with modern technology would look and feel like. And I just started feeling like this is it. Superman's back. When this movie comes out, this is going to be the biggest thing that's ever happened. And I'm not going to have to wait for Superman movies anymore. This is it. He's coming back, and we got Bryan Singer doing it. Oh my God. Right? And then the marketing continued on. And while my personal hype remained sky high because, again, of my belief in Singer, my watching all those blogs and believing all the hype, and my loving the teaser trailer, none of the marketing itself really did much for me. I started feeling like the actual trailers that they released for the film didn't really do the movie any justice. They were like oddly paced. They were using the John Williams march. You could tell like from the original CD, like it wasn't like John Ottman's new orchestrations of it. They were just playing snippets of the original Williams score. And it just felt very much like a nostalgic cash grab. It didn't, the trailers to me didn't sell the movie as something special and can't miss. They felt just oddly off and cold and weird. But even still, you know, it didn't bother. It didn't hinder my personal hype. And when the film, you know, was finally set to come out, I'll never forget how lucky I felt for this, because it was going to come out around June 21st, near my birthday, which is June 23rd. And I had already bought tickets for the Thursday preview showing. I was going to go the night before to Times Square and see it in a sold-out theater surrounded by other rabid fans, when all of a sudden, I want to say on like June 9th, I got a press invitation. I had a connection. There was someone I knew who was a member of the press. They were invited to the movie and they didn't want to go, but they knew me and they were like, "Hey, do you want to go see Superman Returns?" And I'm like, "Yes, I'll see it a week before everyone else does. Sure." And I remember it was June 13th when I got to see it. I got the advanced screening, and just getting to that was its own story, because, you know, screenings happen on off days. Screenings happen on Tuesday nights, typically, you know, on a Tuesday, a Monday, or Wednesday. It's not usually on a main night. And at the end of June and mid-June is when I DJ all kinds of strange middle of the week, middle of the afternoon parties that people throw. So I had to do an afternoon graduation party for a bunch of middle schoolers until 5 p.m. out in Long Island, New York. Okay? The screening began at 7 p.m. right in the heart of Manhattan. And I was going to be around an hour away at 5 o'clock, and I was still going to have to pack up all my gear and hope traffic was going to be okay as I raced into Manhattan to try to make it to this movie on time. Because even though the screening is 7 o'clock, the press passes always let you know that they over-invite to ensure capacity. So you should get there early if you want to make sure you get a seat, and especially if you want a good seat. So I knew I can't just roll up at right before 7. I got to try to get there before 6:30 even. And I'm going to be all the way out in Long Island packing up at 5 o'clock. I probably can't even hit the road till 5:20. This is going to be cutting it really, really tight. And essentially, I was able to enlist the help of friends to make this happen. I had an assistant on the party. He was my friend Michael. And he agreed to okay, after this gig, I'm going to help you pack up at lightning speed. And then we're going to race to the city together. And then you could leave the car with me. I'll go park it somewhere and I'll let you know where I've left it for you. And then meanwhile, my friend Jeremy was going to get there in advance of me to try to hold 2 seats for us, because I was allowed a +1. So I RSVP'd for myself plus Jeremy. So Jeremy agreed to get there at 6. So everything was set, right? The party ends at 5. We packed up so quickly, I swear we were on the road by 5:15. And I remember I'm bobbing and weaving through the Long Island Expressway, humming the Alan Silvestri Back to the Future theme, because that's what makes me drive faster. Because, I'm a normal person like that. And I remember I'm ba, 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 and we're flying from exit 62 of the LIE towards Manhattan. And I remember we made great time until we hit Manhattan. Of course, if anyone's ever driven in the Big Apple, it can be rough, especially when you get to those East River crossings. So once we got into Manhattan now, it was 6 o'clock. Okay, we're an hour from showtime. I can do this. I can do this. And all of a sudden, we just hit this standstill as we're trying to make our way across town. I'm trying to get to the AMC Lincoln Square Theater to try to get to this freaking movie, and we're stuck on 59th Street in traffic that's just crawling, just 1 inch at a time. Terrible. And suddenly at 6:18, I knew I was still more than half a mile away from this theater, and we were stuck, and I wasn't sure how long this was going to take. So Cabby says, why don't you just go right now and I'll take over. I'll start driving. And mind you, Cabby didn't have a license. But I'm like, all right, that sounds great. So right there, not even a red light. We're in stop and go traffic. I got out of the car right there. Cabby took over and I began running. Okay, running through the streets of Manhattan from around 59th Street and 6th Avenue over to 66th Street and Broadway. And I'm asthmatic. Okay, I shouldn't be running. Okay, but this is Superman, pal. And I'd waited 19 years for this, so I was not going to mess around here. So I ran all that way, and at around 6:32, I made it to that freaking theater. And Jeremy met me at the door. He had gotten 2 seats for us. And I remember when we finally got to our 2 seats, and they were great seats. Jeremy crushed it. We were it was row 8 directly in the center. It was exactly how I like it. And it was in the nice theater at Lincoln Square too. They have lots of screens at that theater. I think 15 different movie screens, something like that. And this is the one that they do the big, wonderful movies on. The biggest screen with red curtains and everything. It feels like you're at a grand old movie palace. And right before the movie starts, the curtains open extra wide. And for press screenings, they don't show trailers. It always just rolls directly into the movie. So I remember when we finally got into our seats, my heart is still racing. I'm sweating. I'm coming down. When all of a sudden the lights dimmed and the music starts and we get the opening text. It was another one where, just like I grabbed Joel's arm the year before watching the teaser, now I grabbed Jeremy's arm, and it was I just couldn't believe it. This is real life. I'm about to see Superman. My Superman is about to be up there. I get emotional talking about it now, because that's how much this guy means to me. I had waited so long to see my guy, and there he was. So for 2.5 hours, I was in heaven. I spent 2.5 hours watching this movie, and any critical sense I had was right out the window. I was just a fan. I was that 4-year-old boy that saw Superman 4 all over again, just sitting there in awe watching this Superman story unfold. And I remember going to eat at the noodle house across the street afterward, and me and Jeremy just talking about like, wow, they did it. They nailed it. That was Superman Returns. Like, he's back. And once everyone gets to see this, like, that's it. We're golden. Superman is here again. You know, I really didn't see the ultimate cold shoulder this movie was going to get coming. I didn't, you know, to me, it seemed like this is going to work. They did it. They brought my boy back, you know, but this was a week before the film came out. When the film actually came out, that's when we found out what the rest of the world thought of it. And, well, you know, it's a mixed bag because, see, the critical response was relatively positive. It has a 74% on Rotten Tomatoes, and it is ultimately considered a positive experience. 74% doesn't mean it was an overwhelming smash where everyone who saw it said, oh my God, you got to run out there and see this. But it's a fairly decently strong thumbs up saying, okay, this movie is worth your time. To me, I wish it was higher, but still, it was positive. But then the bigger story is the box office. Because here you go. It's the return of arguably the most popular superhero of all time. At a time when the Spider-Man movies are doing insane business. At a time when the X-Men movies are doing really super strong business. So it seemed like a no-brainer that a Superman Returns movie was going to obliterate some records. But when that opening weekend came, it did all right. You know, it did okay. It got $85 million worldwide. And at the time, it had some sort of like a nice, like a little record, like a 5-day record of like the quickest to a certain number that Warner Brothers had ever had. But the number was still pretty soft because, for comparison's sake, it's 85 million that it made worldwide. Only around 56 of that came from the United States, which is where Warner Brothers gets most of its money from. Okay. Meanwhile, X2 made 85 million in just the United States 2 years prior. I think it is 3. And even Spider-Man had made more than that in its opening weekend just 1 year prior or 2 years prior. Like, the benchmarks had been put in certain places, and Superman Returns, right out of the gate, it was showing that there was a lack of enthusiasm for this project. That even though the reviews were positive, people just didn't feel the need to run out and see this movie. And right out of the gates, you started getting a sense that all was not okay in the world of Superman anymore, where maybe this isn't going to be the triumphant return, the triumphant relaunch that many of us thought it had to be, that it was definitely going to be. Instead, it was like, you know, I remember at that time when a movie was doing well, right? If it had a huge killer opening weekend, a lot of times by Monday morning, you start hearing about a sequel. Headlines start coming out where, oh, the director's already signed on for part 2. You know, and that didn't happen when Superman Returns. And as the weeks went on and the box office continued to just be very meh and nothing special, it started becoming clear that I was in the minority when it came to people who loved the film. And that a lot of people found it not particularly rewatchable. So a lot of people saw it once and didn't go back. Me, on the other hand, are you ready for this? Earlier on, I mentioned that I saw X2 3 times. I saw Superman Returns in theaters. I paid for tickets 11 times. Okay. I was so pulling for this movie. I was so enamored by it. I wanted it to hit so bad that every other week while it was out, I was going to see it and I was bringing people with me. 2 of those times I brought my mom, and that said a lot because by that point in 2006, my mom wasn't going to the movies with any real regularity. Going to the movies was like a real rarity for her. And the fact that she wanted to see this movie not once, but 2 different times with me, it spoke to her. And she was my original +1 for Superman movies because she's the one who took me to see Superman 4 at the Elmwood back in '87. So I had so many tremendously special experiences getting to see this movie with different people beside me each time, and all of us agreeing that this is a pretty special movie. Why don't people love it more? And it's still something to this day that I grapple with. Here we are 18 years later. And there's a part of me that's still that fan going, but why didn't we get more of that? I know that it was not a perfect film, and there's things I can be very hard on it for nowadays. But at the time, there was just nothing about it to me that screamed, this needs to be one and done. We need to move away and reboot. When you see franchises that got rebooted, it was usually because the last film was a notorious turd. You know what I mean? Batman and Robin did so poorly and did such a number on the Batman IP that they had to reboot it, right? Die Another Day, starring Pierce Brosnan, did such a number on the James Bond franchise with its diamond-crusted villain and invisible cars and just over-the-top ridiculousness that, once again, they had to reboot James Bond and make it more realistic and gritty and try to update it and modernize it. Usually when something gets rebooted, it's because the last film in its franchise was regarded as a huge, disastrous way to go. And now we have to basically apologize for that by starting from scratch again. That's typically been the reason to reboot and move on from something. And Superman Returns wasn't that. Say what you will about it. You might say it was a little boring. You might say it could have used more action. You might say you wish Superman hit things more often in it. But you can't say it's a bad movie. Maybe you can. Opinions are subjective. It is what it is. But to me, I never understood why we didn't continue on from there. And the limbo that we entered after Superman Returns was a really kind of endless, confusing one. Especially when you consider that the film's director seemed to acknowledge there were issues with the first one. Bryan Singer knew that Superman Returns didn't necessarily connect as well as it could have with mass audiences. He acknowledged that it was kind of a slow, somber, nostalgic piece. And he acknowledged that, maybe, later on he had some big regrets for how he handled it. But even at the time, he was acknowledging that, the next one is going to be more action, adventure, sci-fi epic. And he was drawing comparisons to Star Trek: The Wrath of Khan. What that Star Trek sequel was in relation to its first film, he was saying that his sequel was going to be to Superman Returns. And he'd already pulled off a leveling up like that before. Because in the X-Men movies, if you think about it, the first movie was a little bit slower and it was more focused on just sort of setting up all the big parts of this universe. And then it was in X2 where things got really exciting. And he was essentially promising to do that with Superman, treating the Superman Returns like the first X-Men movie or the first Star Trek movie, and treating Man of Steel, which is what he was calling the sequel, Man of Steel, treating that one like the Wrath of Khan to Star Trek or the X2 to X-Men, that sequel that just takes everything to that next big crazy level. And as somebody who loved X2 and was only so-so on the X1, again, Singer was saying all the right things, and I was so ready for whatever his Man of Steel was going to be, except we didn't end up getting his Man of Steel. And it's not a huge reason as to why. It's not a huge, I guess I should say, it's not a huge mystery as to why he didn't get that, because in Hollywood, money talks. So even though the reviews were fairly positive, even though you had plenty of hardcore Superman fans like me absolutely in love with the film and going on message boards talking about how wonderful it was. The film's box office ended at $391 million worldwide, which that is really, really low when you have a $204 million budget and your star is Superman. And you're coming out at a time when superhero movies are doing really, really well. So 391 was a terrible number. The film didn't even double its budget, so it did not turn a profit. And that budget was higher than it needed to be because it carried the costs of previous Superman projects into it. So no matter how you slice it, Warner Brothers looked at this project and said, this was a money loser for us. And we cannot afford to continue on from here. And yet they didn't make any outright decisions about that until around 2008, 2009, when they finally decided we're going to reboot. And you should go check out the episode of this show called Rebooting Superman, which is all about Man of Steel, which was the next time they tried to get Superman going again. But it took a few years to finally find out that Superman Returns was not getting a sequel. And, in that time, I had plenty of time to reflect and watch the film a few more times and share it with a few more people, because I still to this day think it's a very special Superman movie. But, it's time to really talk about the film without the rose-tinted glasses, without, the awestruck Superman geek that I was in 2006. Let's just talk about it honestly. So Superman Returns, the movie had its issues, okay? It was long. It was light on action. A lot of its story points are basic echoes of Superman the movie. It follows a lot of a similar pattern to Superman the movie. And then right down to the biggest glaring issue, which is every good superhero needs a good supervillain. And in this particular case, we had good casting. We had Kevin Spacey. This is before he was canceled, before we knew more about who he was. But at the time, landing Kevin Spacey as Lex Luthor was a big deal. And his big villain plot was this kind of ridiculous, half-baked idea of taking Kryptonian crystals and trying to build new land masses, and he would be the ruler of these new land masses, and people would die, and Superman wouldn't be able to stop him somehow. And it was a very convoluted, unexciting, illogical villain plot. Because, of course, he references, I have alien technology far beyond what anyone else can do. Who can touch me? But we don't see him using any of the alien technology. In the movie, we just see him dropping bits of crystal into water, and then the crystal grows into these big crystalline structures. But we didn't see any kind of weaponry. We didn't see him, learning how to use any computer systems. We didn't see how it was that this criminal genius planned on ruling over everyone from this new Krypton he was building. It was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous plot. And then to me, the biggest issue of all was Kate Bosworth's Lois Lane. Kate Bosworth's Lois Lane was a huge negative mark on this movie. She had hardly any chemistry whatsoever with Brandon Routh's Superman, which is a crime. If you're going to try to evoke the Reeve movies, okay? The Reeve movies lived and died on the chemistry between him and Margot Kidder. Okay, say what you will about the age differences, say what you will about what would eventually go on with Lois in those original movies where they eventually kind of like friend-zoned her and made her like Clark's lovable older sister by Superman 4. Say what you will about those. The connection between Reeve and Kidder was palpable and magnetic and something you could build around. Okay? Routh and Bosworth had zero chemistry. And it makes you wonder, what did Singer see? Or maybe Singer didn't see anything. Because by all accounts, the reason that he cast Kate Bosworth was because Kevin Spacey told him to. His buddy Kevin Spacey had just finished Beyond the Sea, the movie about Bobby Darin, and he'd worked with Kate Bosworth on there, and he liked her in there. So he told Bryan Singer, "Oh, you should get Katie to be Lois. She'd be great." And I don't even know if she auditioned. Maybe she did. But the point is, Bryan hired his friend's recommendation. And to me, between the no chemistry at all, between seeming way too young for a veteran Pulitzer Prize winning mother Lois Lane 5 years after the events of Superman 2, she looked like a kid. She looks like she's 23. You know what I mean? She looked like the boy's older sister. She was just miscast in every conceivable way. And then this chick didn't even want to dye her hair. She wore a wig, and you can tell she had this dead, lifeless mop on top of her head the whole movie. Like, to me, if you can't even be bothered to dye your hair to play Lois Lane, then you don't get to play Lois Lane. You don't deserve it. Okay? So Kate Bosworth, to me, was a huge issue. The villain plot was a huge issue. And then just the fact that the film was a little bit, slow and long and plodding at times. It didn't need to be that way. They could have tightened this whole thing up. That's where, to me, it all goes back to Bryan's pitch back in June of 2004. Because, he was already in the early stages of development on X-Men 3 and on a remake of Logan's Run. Like, he already had a busy dance card. He was stacked. He was an in-demand an in-demand director in Hollywood at the time, when Warner Brothers suddenly reached out and said, "Hey, if you got any Superman ideas, we'd like to hear them." And Bryan dropped everything. Bryan Singer dropped everything and flew to Hawaii for a weekend with his writers, Dan Harris and Michael Dougherty from X2. And together, in a 3 or 4 day fever dream of mapping out this movie, they came up with the movie. And, at the time, it's funny, he would brag about it. You could see it in documentaries. You could see it in the Bryan's blogs. He was really proud of the fact that they came up with most of this movie in just a matter of a few days on vacation in Hawaii. And my big issue is, Bryan, it shows. This movie looks like it was cooked up in just a few days in terms of its storyline. Who thought that Lex villain plot was strong enough for this? Who thought that a movie that tried to make you think about the Christopher Reeve Superman, but make him so sad and depressed the whole time, who thought that was a good idea? Because here's the thing, a lot of people to this day point at Superman Returns as if it was an exact replica of Superman the movie. And that film's failure shows why you couldn't do a Christopher Reeve style Superman movie in the modern era, because people would reject it just like they rejected Superman Returns. But that's nonsense. If you go watch back to back Superman the movie and Superman Returns, you're going to notice right away there's a huge tonal difference between the two. Okay? Superman Returns only really focuses on the more somber elements of being Superman. It's a very sort of sad, weird story. I did a little, miniature recap of it in last week's show, but just to sort of remind you, okay? We have a Superman who feels so alone and so desperate to try to connect with someone who's like him, that he abandons Earth without even saying goodbye to Lois. Think about that. Can you imagine the Christopher Reeve Superman just going, "I'm out of here," and not even saying goodbye to Lois? Again, the whole thing is so sort of like, it's half-baked. It's half well thought out. But you gave us a Superman story where he's so unbelievably lonely that he deserts Lois, deserts Earth right after he's promised the president of the United States at the end of Superman 2. He apologized for being away while General Zod and his minions attacked the country. He said he would never do that again. But according to this, he leaves the planet shortly after. It doesn't make sense. But he's so desperately alone that he flies out and he leaves Earth for 5 years. And when he comes back, what does he find? Not only did he not find any survivors, and not only did it confirm that he really is an orphan and that what's left of his home planet is actually kryptonite now and is trying to kill him. Well, the good news is now you're back on Earth where Lois has a new boyfriend. Oh, and has a 5-year-old son. How about that? So now he doesn't have Lois to turn to. There was the one human he had some real connection with. He's just this lonely guy looking at the people of Earth that he's indebted with having to protect because he's accepted this responsibility. But there's just this sadness and this loneliness to this character. And the film in general, it didn't have a lot of the charm and the joy of being Superman that the original one did. And not that it had to. I'm not saying it had to have that, but this was definitely not a clone of the Superman Reeve Superman movies. It didn't have that joy. This was a sad song. This was a ballad. This was a Superman story for people who love Superman, but they love analyzing the unbearable responsibility and loneliness of Superman. And that speaks to me. That's one of the reasons I loved it so much, and I still love it to this day, because that is an aspect of the character that makes me relate to him and makes me connect to that character so much. Because that's the thing I always go back to with the Reeve portrayal of Superman, that what made it really special was the bittersweetness of it all. The bittersweetness, if you go back and watch those movies, I always got this underlying sense of this kind, beautiful soul that just adores us, but will never be one of us. And that always just kind of stuck with me, because you put yourself in that sort of character's shoes where, especially after Superman 2, where he falls in love and he starts getting to feel a semblance of what it would be like to be human after growing up on the farm with Ma and Pa and being ambushed with this idea that, no, you're from another planet and all this, all of a sudden he got a taste of what it takes to be, what it could be to just not have that huge responsibility of taking care of the world. And you could just focus on being Clark Kent and loving Lois and not having to pretend to be something that you're not. And the second he let his guard down, that's when everything went to hell with Zod and his forces attacking Earth. And he had to learn a very painful lesson about, I can't be selfish. Someone like me who can do what I can do has to do it. And you could tell he loves to do it. He wants to do it. But James Gunn points out, the wry smile on Reeves' Superman's face at times after he does something nice. You could tell it tickles him to do good things. And at the same time, in the script, there was always just that element of, yes, but you're an alien and you'll never be one of them. And, it's just that bittersweetness, that melancholy of the character is one of the things that really drew me to the characters. One of my favorite things that I love about those early Reeve Superman movies. I mean, he maintained it throughout, but even as the movies got goofy, he always maintained this really kind, vulnerable, emotional center to him. So, this movie leaned into all of that. It focused very heavily in on just that part of him being that outsider alien who, every day people cry out for my help and I can actually hear them. So I have to do something about it. And that's why Lois, I had to do what I did and I disappeared and I'm sorry, but, I'm Superman. It's such a, the movie, it's beautiful and it's heartbreaking and it's tragic in its ways. And it speaks, it spoke volumes to people like me who loved very much so those aspects of Superman. So I totally get it. And I totally appreciated it. Hence why I went to go see it 11 freaking times in theaters. To my particular type of Superman fan, that movie was a home run. The issues I have with it now in hindsight, they're issues I could deal with it. To me, the pros far outweigh the cons. And I'm going to upload an entire, just a review for the entire movie as separate of this, just a discussion on Superman Returns, just a film review, just as I intend to do, just film reviews for each of the Superman films that have come out so far. So, and audio commentaries also for those of you who would like to join me on any of these little ventures back into Superman cinematic history as we get ready for James Gunn's Superman. I'd love it if you all join me on these little escapades that are coming up. But, while I ultimately appreciated and really understood why Singer went there, and I'll wax poetic about all that elsewhere, but the final thing I'll say about the movie for now is that ultimately Superman Returns' legacy is as the closing of that particular Superman trilogy for me. For me, now the real story of that Superman is Superman 1, 2, and Returns. And if we think of the ending of that movie as the culmination of Superman's arc, it's actually a triumphant conclusion to that story. Because if the big running theme is Superman the orphan, Superman who's desperate to connect, Superman who loves us but will never be one of us, well, at the end when he's delivering that Kryptonian rite of passage to his son, who is half Kryptonian and half of this earth, a child that he had with Lois, a human woman he had a child with. Now he's got real ties and real roots to Earth. So for me, if the Reeve, the melancholic end of the Reeve Superman, of the man on the outside who'll never get to be one of us, his big silver lining, his big happy ending now, is that forever he'll get to raise this boy alongside Lois, and he's in a certain way now, he's one of us. So that's to me, that is the legacy of Superman Returns. I now understand all these years later that it's just at that moment in time, what people wanted was not a ballad. People wanted something uplifting and catchy and exciting. Luckily for all of us, on July 11th, 2025, I think that's exactly what we're going to get, because James Gunn seems to understand that particular assignment. He knows, I believe, what kind of song Superman should be. So let's see. Let's see how that goes. But thank you for joining me here on episode 11, The Ballad of Superman Returns. Hopefully you got something out of this. Please, if you did, like, rate, and review the show. Subscribe. Tell your friends. Put this show in the path of someone who doesn't listen but you think should. All right? Help a brother out. And there are some interesting milestones. The YouTube channel has hit 1,000 subscribers. So thank you very much. Over on Threads, I surpassed 500 follows at the Superman on Film. And Superman on Film on X, I now have over 4,600 followers there. So things are growing at a nice steady clip. And I just want to thank you all who are supporting me here on this new venture and on this countdown to the arrival of James Gunn's Superman and retrospective look at all the twists and turns of Superman on Film along the way. Thank you. And until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up, and away.